All right, so Romans chapter 14.
Is that 14?
14. 1-4. Are we good? That was a really rough start. I haven't had a rough start like that in a while. Let's see if we can recover. Hey, you know, I talk about the kids a lot. I talk about Allie and Alex a lot. And someday they might grow up and watch these videos and they're going to say, "Oh, Dad, I can't believe you shared that." But a lot of it relates back to things that I've learned along the way and how them being in my life and in our life has helped me to grow. Has helped me to see things a different way. Because you just have a different perspective in life as a parent than when you weren't a parent. Everything changes. And one of the things that I just didn't understand pre-kids was how much fun I would have playing with my kids. Especially at this age, because they're really getting into the good toys. They are. They're really getting into the good toys. And like I'm on the fence of thinking about a nice remote control car for Alex. You know how that goes, right? You know, and of course if he has one, then I should probably have one so that we can do it together. You know, I mean, that's just how it works. And over the years, things that I had kind of hung on to and kept for my kids someday, they're finally getting to the point that they can use. Like the race control track, the little RC tracks, those are great. We've been pulling those out and playing with them, and Alex has a good time. And I pulled out my old Legos. I don't know if any of you kept those.
And you didn't invite me?
I didn't invite you, but when I got it out, I made sure to take time to show my kids how to use it. You know, so I made them sit and watch a little bit as I was playing and have a good time. And it wasn't long, like 30 seconds, that they sat there. And they began to share something that I've probably told them. They have definitely told me before, that I have told others, and that I've heard in a lot of different settings. You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. And I was trying to help them. No, I'm not doing it wrong. These were my Legos. I know what I'm doing. It's been a few years, but I haven't forgotten everything. I know what I'm doing here. And it wasn't long until Alex just started picking up the toys and he's like, "No, Daddy, it's this way. You do it this way. You're doing it wrong." It's a phrase that I've heard so many times. Whether we're playing a game, whether we're playing cards, and I don't know if you guys have played Old Maid, if you've ever played that. Okay, well there's two ways to play Old Maid. Did you know this? And it depends on how the game goes. One, the traditional way, the way I always played, if you got Old Maid, you lost, right? However, I have learned that sometimes when kids get the Old Maid card, they win. They change the rules midstream, and I'm like, wait a minute. That's not how it works. Whoever gets the Old Maid card is supposed to lose. But that phrase, "you're doing it wrong," it's something that we're so familiar with. We hear it in so many different ways, so many different avenues, so many different settings. We sometimes hear it in church, so we sometimes hear it at home, we sometimes hear it at work. And I can't think of a place where we haven't heard those words. Can you? You're doing it wrong. And it leaves us very frustrated. Because if we're honest, we don't always like being told that I'm doing it wrong. In fact, I don't know that I ever like it. I like to do things the way I like to do it. That's something that we have in common at any age. Whether my kids want to do it the way they want to do it now, or I want to do it the way I want to do it as an adult. It's something that stays with us, that attitude of, I know what I'm doing, and my way is the best way. In fact, I think one of my favorite Frank Sinatra songs was My Way, right? We like to do things our way. That attitude of everybody else is doing it wrong and I'm doing it right just doesn't go away as we become adults. Now, we may say it less, but I don't know that that means that we think it less. And when I go to one of my favorite things is driving. How many times do we criticize other drivers on the road?
Countless.
Never.
Countless.
It is such a good thing that we are in church. And a good opportunity for confession. We love to do these things. We love to criticize people for doing it wrong or not doing it the way we would do. Have you ever yelled at somebody to go at a stop sign because they weren't moving fast enough? Yeah, absolutely. Or yell at them because they didn't stop and it was clearly your turn. They were doing it wrong. Those attitudes of you're doing it wrong, you're not doing it my way, they just don't disappear as we become adults. In fact, they impact every area of our life, and they impact our faith as well. It's something that seems to just absolutely stay the same throughout time. Because in Romans chapter 14, Paul is talking to the church exactly about this. There's groups within the church. He calls them the weak and strong, the way he identifies them. And guess what the weak say to the strong? I'm so glad you got that. Guess what the strong say to the weak? That was better. Guess what Paul says to the weak and the strong? You're doing it wrong, right? So let's see what Paul writes here in Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. Accept him whose faith is weak, without passing judgment on disputable matters. One's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not. And the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does. For God has accepted him. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God, and he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. You then, why do you judge your brother? Or why do you look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me. Every tongue will confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. We read that passage, and then a lot of times if we go back and we look at verse 13, we cancel everything out. It says, therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way. And I will tell you, often that verse right there is then used to elevate the position of the weak that Paul has identified here, and it's used to tell the strong to just stop. I want to look at this, and there's a couple points in here today. If you have your bulletins, there is this amazing section in there called Sermon Notes. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but right on the back is a place that you can write some sermon notes. And I have some points. I have 3 points I want you to write down today, because there's 3 really great points in this passage. And the first one is, a Christian is a servant of God, and therefore part of God's household. Now, how many of you have servants? How many of you feel like a servant at home? Maybe a different question.
Go ahead.
But there was this amazing thing. There were a lot of people who had servants, and they would come in and take care of the matters of the house. And when you became a servant, it was more than just showing up for work and going home. That became your home. You became part of that household. You lived there. You did everything in that place. That's a different concept for us, because although we might have someone to come over and help with something, we might hire someone to clean, or we might hire someone to help with grass, or we might hire someone to do work on our house. They come, they do their job, and then what do?
Leave.
They leave, right? They go home, and we go back to our house being the way it is. But in this idea of being a servant of God, it's not that we just show up, we do something for a while, and then we leave. As we become a servant of God, we actually become members of God's household. What do you think about that? That's a little different perspective, isn't it? Because most of us have heard the idea that we are servants of God. Most of us think of ourselves as Christ followers, and we go to church, we engage for about an hour, and then we disengage, we go back to our own homes and do stuff the way we have always done it. And even in church, we can be very guilty of talking about how glad we are that God is part of our life. And it's almost as though we take God and we insert God into our household, so then God is to do what? Live under our rules, make our life better, and really not inconvenience us in any matter. This is something that we've really kind of put forward in the church. We talk about God coming into our life all the time. We talk about God making our life better. And when we're talking about it being our life, who's the focus on? Us. I've said for years that the church has turned God into something like a side dish, as in mashed potatoes. I love mashed potatoes. I could have mashed potatoes every meal. I know they're not good for me, but I could have mashed potatoes with every meal. But there is something about mashed potatoes. It's a salad, right? It's not the main course. And so in many ways, what we have done is say, God, we want you to come along and to enhance what we already have, to make things better. God, you become part of my house. But that's not what Paul says here. Paul actually says the Christian is a servant. And as a servant, you are members of the master's household. We get the relationship with God confused often. Many times, when we think of adding God to our household, adding God to our life, we have ourselves in the position of the master of the home. And we have God in the position of servant. What Paul says here is you've got it backwards. You're not the master. God is. God's not the servant. You are. Anybody really like this? Because I don't hear a single amen. Because we're sitting there, we're saying, wait a minute. I don't know how I feel about being God's servant. Because God might do it wrong. And by doing it wrong, I mean not doing it my way. You ever had that conversation with God? God, you aren't doing it my way. In fact, sometimes I've told God, I think you messed it up. I don't like this. I'm not happy, God. Your job is to make my life better. Now, we don't have this conversation, right? But we do internally. God, I'm unhappy. Your job is to make me happy. That's why I brought you into my life, God. You're to make my life better. That's what I've been told. And God, you're not living up to your end of the deal. Some of you are thinking, man, I would never have that conversation. I absolutely have. I absolutely have. And it's been amazing that God has reminded me of my position in life. Not as one who is in charge, but one who is a servant. And so when we start to set the relationship right, and to remember that Christians don't go home to become masters of their household, adding God in, they become members of God's household, it starts to change the picture. And instead of seeing my life as something that I have planned out, I began to see it in a way where I am living and honoring God all the time. And it really sets the tone for this passage. So it is okay to think about yourself as God's servant. Because according to the scriptures, that's truly who you are if you're a Christian. As one who's not living for you, but living for God. It gets our focus right. It's not about making God part of our family. It's about becoming part of God's family. And I love that change. Because we just don't think about it enough. we talk about the day that we accept Christ, the day that we welcome God into our life. Many of us think about that. And maybe we'll take a step. On this day I was baptized. On this day I got involved more in the church. We think about it as steps that we have grown, and in that way God has moved us along. But it's completely different. When we accept Christ, it's actually like getting keys and your last name changes into God's household. Does that make sense? I hope so, because if that doesn't make sense, we're in trouble. I'll try and go back and explain it if it doesn't. But it sets the perspective right. It's not just about us deciding what is wrong and right, because if it's not my household, I don't get to decide all that stuff. And I will tell you that I am much more flexible when I walk into someone else's house as to how they do things than when things are done in my house. There are things that I want done a certain way. And if I know that I'm moving into God's house, then I know that right off the bat, I'm not the one in charge. So it's a perspective changer. And I want you to think about it. I want you to write it down. I'm not living in my house with God. I am living in God's house as His. Tremendous difference. Paul really hammers this point home, talking about who were you to judge someone else's servant. See, in Paul's eyes, I think Paul really does understand it. He sees the church, the weak and the strong, arguing about stuff that mattered to them, but stuff that really missed the heart of life, the heart of what it meant to be a Christian. And the weak and the strong are judging one another, saying, well, you should eat everything. No, you should eat only this. You should abstain from all that stuff. You should worship God every day of the week. Well, you should worship God on Sundays or whatever it may be. And if you look throughout our society, we have done this. Over the years, I've had lots of conversations with Christians about the ending of blue laws in the state of Pennsylvania. And remembering back to the days when everything was shut down because that was the day that we honored God. And my argument then, and my argument now, is that every day is a day to honor God. And really, I think you could take that and you could make a case that it was just what was going on here that Paul was addressing with the weak and the strong. Saying, you've got to do it this way. You've got to do it this way in order for God to be honored. Trying to make sure that everyone follows my understanding. That everyone does it in a way that I'm comfortable with. And isn't that what the weak and the strong are arguing about? They're arguing about whose way is right. Is it the way of the weak? Is it the way of the strong? Which one is it? And Paul says, if you try to decide if it's the way of the weak or the way of the strong, you are going to miss the point completely, because it's not about what you think. One of my favorite lines that I actually remember from a book. A lot of times I read the book, I remember the main themes. But it was Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren. It's not about you. And over the years, I go back to that and reference that time and time again, because we fall under the delusion that it's about me. Guess what? Weak and strong? Who's it about? It's about them. It's about me on both sides. Paul says, weak, it's not about you. Paul says, strong, it's not about you. It's about God. Which means I don't necessarily get to decide who's right, and more importantly, who's wrong. And then he goes a step further. He said, this is what you guys are missing. You're on both sides. You're separated by this decision that this way is right and this way is right. And so there's this major division in between you. And here's what you guys are missing. Weak, what you're doing is coming out of a desire to honor God. Strong, what you are doing is coming out of a desire to honor God. That means that both of these, even though you have very different perspectives, are growing from a similar root. A similar desire to honor God. Because as we read here in the Weak and Strong, this is a letter written to the church, right? This wasn't written to people who had nothing to do with church. This wasn't written as an evangelical letter. This was written to the church, people who were following Christ, trying to figure this out. And they were doing what we so often do anytime we try to worship God, complicated, and add some good man-made rules in there so that we can decide who's right and who's wrong. And I will tell you, the writers of the rules are the ones who are always right. Just ask them. If you've ever written rules, I bet you wrote the right rules. For perspective, you write a set of rules for your house, let your kids write a set of rules for the house. Which one are you going to pick? You're going to pick yours. Always. But this weak and this strong, although they're very opposed in what they're saying, their desire is the same. What's their desire? To honor God, right? They're saying, hey, we know that our lives have been drastically changed because of what Christ did. And we know that God is giving us something that we couldn't earn on ourselves. And I feel like I should do something to honor God. And so what I'm going to do is set one day apart, and I'm going to worship God on that day. Group over here says, my life has been drastically changed by God. Things are different than I ever dreamed they could be. And you know what? In the past, I lived every day for me. I'm going to live every day for God. I'm going to make every day a way that I can honor God through life. They end up with a very different result, but the desire is the same. Does that make sense? The same thing happens with food. We have the weak on one side, and they say, I'm only going to eat vegetables because I don't want to touch anything that might be unclean. I want to live my life in a way that honors God. And so the stuff that I put into my body, I'm only going to eat stuff that I believe honors God. And we come over here to the strong side. Guess what they say? God has made everything clean. And I am going to eat everything that God has made because God has made it all clean. And in this way, honoring God. Paul does not say, strong, God has a problem with your position. Likewise, Paul doesn't say, weak, God has a problem with your position. Paul says, God has a problem with you guys putting each other down because of your positions. You see the difference? Because what they were trying to do then was to establish the hierarchy, because we always want to know who's the best. We always want to know who's in first place. And we always want to know who's in last place. And we want to make sure it's not us. We want to know where we fit, how we line up. God, am I doing better than this group? God, am I honoring you more than this person? God, am I showing you that your investment is a worthwhile investment? And Paul says you need to stop. Because you're trying to decide stuff you have no business deciding. You have no real way to make this decision. And it's not your place. Because I know this group's trying to honor God. And I know this group is trying to honor God. And it is God's job to decide that. So that was the second point. These practices, they grow from a common root. They're being done to honor God. And that really becomes the rationale. Whatever you're doing, anything in your life, is it being done to honor God? If the answer is yes, do it. If it's being done to honor you, stop it. The third, and we've actually touched on this a little bit, Paul's really clear. Whose place is it to judge? God's, right? It is God's place to judge. And we're not talking about saying that everything is okay. We're not talking about being permissive and just letting sin go. We've talked about this time and time again. This is the church. And we have a weak group, we have a strong group, and they're saying weak Christians are better than strong Christians are better than weak Christians, meat eaters are better than vegetarians. Well, it almost sounds like Facebook, doesn't it?
Wow.
Or social media, or anything that you want to go to. Isn't it easy to identify this? Because we still do this stuff. We want to know, am I better? And Paul says, stop it. Because there's only one judge. There's only one who gets to make the decision about all of these things in life. And guess who it isn't? It's not you. And it's not me. And if you find yourself sitting there saying, well, I am more holy than them. Probably not with that statement. That's a very prideful statement. We don't think about that, do we? One of my favorite stories from college, and some of you have heard this, some of you haven't. If you have, bear with me. It's still worth repeating. But one of my favorite stories from college was one of my professors who was preaching a sermon on sin. And it was a Sunday evening sermon, and we don't have Sunday evening sermons. We do a Sunday evening small group. But by the time, as I grew up in church, I told you I went Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening. And you know what happened? Good sized group, smaller group, holy group. By the time we got to Wednesday, the holiness increased. I'm totally joking on that. Especially since we're talking about a sermon on judgment, right? But that was my perception growing up. And so it was a Sunday evening service, and of the two, the Sunday evening is more commitment. If you're going to come Sunday morning and Sunday evening, that's a step in the right direction. And so he was preaching this message on sin and talking just about how sin destroys our life, which I fully agree with. There are just immediate concepts, there are consequences and long-term consequences with sin. And so he preached the message, gave the altar call, nobody went forward, but on the way out, this older lady stopped and she said, Pastor, man, am I glad to hear you preach on sin. It has been so long since a pastor in this church has just hammered on sin the way you did. I want you to know a couple things. Number one, I'm just sorry that we didn't have more people here to hear it who needed it. Because there were a few who really, and she kind of listed them off. I wish they'd have been here to hear it. And then she said, Pastor, I want you to know, I haven't sinned in 10 years. She absolutely just did. He said, I walked out and I just kind of hung my head. I'm like, went right over it. Missed it. But it is so easy to fall into that seat of judgment. What Paul tells us is actually quoting the scripture here, is that one day, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. And in that moment, we will stand before the judgment seat. And guess who God is going to question me about?
You.
Question me about you. And guess who God is going to question you about?
Me. You.
Not quite. God is going to be concerned with how I lived. And God is going to be concerned with how you lived. And all of the judgments that we make in between aren't going to matter. All the times that we decided that we were holier than somebody else, it's not going to matter. Because it's not about being better than somebody else. It's not about showing God that I'm a better investment than all these other people. It's not about bringing God into my house and making my life better. It's about saying, God, I'm going to stop living for me and start living for you. You know what, God? I'm going to try and let you call the shots. Even though I'm really, really used to saying you're doing it wrong. The sermon title is Faith That Is Deep and Wide. Most of the time, we live with faith that is shallow and narrow. It's shallow and narrow because we make God's faith fit us. We take God and say, God, you need to do it the way I understand. If you want faith that is deep and wide, stop trying to bring God into your life and get into God's life. Because I will guarantee that it's going to make your faith deeper than you've ever thought it could be. Because if you actually join God's house, you're going to be under God's rules. It's going to change the way you live. And if you want it to go wide, because God's house seems to just kind of swallow us up. We don't get to control God the way we typically would. And so I really want you to think about this today. Maybe it's not so much about us accepting God. Maybe it's much more about us realizing that God accepts us into his house. And I think that's a really good place to stop. I want you to hear, without a doubt, that God loves you. Not because of what you have done, or what you could do, or anything along that line. Not because you were holier or better than anyone else, but because God has chosen to love you. Not based on performance, but based on God's decision of who God is. It's an invitation to join God in his house today, in this world, and into eternity. And if you've made that decision, but honestly it's been more about making God fit into your life than fitting into God's life, then I'd encourage you to also have that conversation with God. You know what, God? Forgive me for trying to make you fit into my life. Help me fit with you. So we all have a place to pray today. We all have something that we can use and go with and grow from. Even if it's just confessing, God, so often I tell you you're doing it wrong and I'm sorry. Forgive me. Let's pray. Dear God, we confess that so often we tell you you are wrong. And we treat you as one who needs to come into our life and follow our rules. But God, the truth is, we need to come into your home. We need to accept our place as members of your household. And to understand that it is your judgment that matters and not ours. God, thank you for loving us the way you do. Thank you for accepting us. God, thank you for loving us. And for giving us grace when we tell you how it should be done. And when we criticize you for doing it wrong. God, thank you for being you. Thank you for just loving us the way that you do and leading us and guiding, moving us in your direction. I pray these things through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.